The little black girl cried to the biker, saying someone marked her path across the dunes all afternoon. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. It was late afternoon when little Aisha Coleman, no older than 10, came sprinting across the sand dunes. Her small feet kicked up dust as she ran towards the nearest group of bikers gathered by their motorcycles. Tears streaked down her face, her breath ragged and frantic. She was terrified. Behind her, the endless horizon of the desert stretched out, but the only thing on her mind was the man who had been following her. She reached the group of bikers and collapsed into the arms of one of them, a grizzled man in his 40s with a leather vest and a tattoo of a wolf on his arm. "Please," she cried, "someone's been marking my path across the dunes all afternoon. He's been following me." The bikers exchanged glances, their expressions serious. They were used to handling trouble, but they weren't used to seeing a child in this kind of distress. Jack Bear McKinley, the leader of the group, stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking the harsh sun as he knelt down to her level. "It's okay, kid. You're safe now," he said, his voice deep but gentle. He scanned the horizon, his trained eyes already calculating the situation. Aisha's sobs slowed as she looked up at him, her fear not entirely gone but starting to subside. "I don't know who he is, but he's been watching me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I tried to hide, but he keeps finding me." Jack's jaw clenched. He'd seen this before. People who thought they could run, people who thought they could escape their pasts. But they didn't know what they were up against when they were dealing with the Iron Riders. "All right, we're going to help you," Bear said. "You stay here with Tommy." He looked to another member of the club, a younger man with a buzz cut and a scar over his left eye. Tommy nodded and moved to comfort Aisha. Bear turned to the rest of the bikers. "We're not leaving until we figure out what's going on." As Bear spoke, the rest of the bikers began to ready their bikes, the engines roaring to life as they prepared for a ride into the unknown. "Do you know where he went?" Bear asked Aisha. The little girl hesitated, then pointed off towards the east, where the dunes met the faint outline of a small settlement in the distance. "That way," she said softly. Jack nodded and gave a signal to the group. "Let's move. Keep your eyes peeled." The group of bikers revved their engines and took off, the rumble of their motorcycles echoing through the desert. They didn't know who was following Aisha or why, but they were going to find out. With the sun setting behind them, they rode across the endless dunes, the wind whipping past them like a reminder of the danger that lay ahead. Aisha clung to Tommy's bike as they sped off, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. She still didn't know what to expect, but she was beginning to trust these strangers, these bikers who were now her protectors. As they rode into the unknown, one thing was clear: they would stop at nothing to keep her safe. As the group of bikers sped across the desert, Aisha clung tightly to Tommy's motorcycle. Her small body shook with fear, but Tommy's firm grip on the handlebars gave her a sense of safety. The rumble of the engines was deafening, but in her mind, the only sound she could hear was the rapid beating of her own heart. She had never been this far from home, and she had no idea what was waiting for her at the end of this ride. She just knew that the man who had been following her was still out there, and that made her stomach churn with dread. As the sun dipped lower behind the dunes, casting long shadows across the sand, the bikers rode in formation, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They didn't speak much, but their presence alone made Aisha feel a little more secure. Jack Bear McKinley led the way, his large frame cutting a commanding figure as he navigated through the twisting paths. The other bikers followed closely, their powerful motorcycles kicking up dust in their wake. It was hard to believe that only a few hours ago, she had been running alone through the dunes, terrified and uncertain. Now, she was part of a group, and they had become her protectors. Bear kept a sharp eye on the horizon, scanning for any signs of danger. He knew that whoever had been following Aisha had to be dealt with, but he didn't want to make any rash moves. The desert could be unforgiving, and the last thing they needed was to get caught in a dangerous situation without enough information. The ride continued for what felt like hours. Aisha's arms began to ache, and her mind wandered back to the events that had led her here. She couldn't help but think about the strange man who had been watching her all afternoon. His eyes, cold and calculating, haunted her. She didn't know who he was or why he was following her, but she felt like he was always just a few steps behind. Every time she thought she had lost him, he reappeared. It wasn't until she had reached the edge of the dunes that she had seen the bikers. They were a far cry from what she had imagined when she first heard about them. She had always thought of bikers as rough, dangerous people, but the ones she had met seemed different. They were kind, reassuring, and determined to protect her at all costs. Her thoughts were interrupted as the lead bikers began to slow down, and Bear's voice crackled through the radio. "This is it," he said, his tone serious. "Everyone stay sharp. We're close." The group slowed to a crawl as they approached the small settlement on the edge of the desert. The buildings were run down, with peeling paint and sagging roofs, but the area had a sense of isolation that made Aisha uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Bear signaled for the group to stop a few yards from the town. He turned to Aisha, his eyes softening. "Stay close, kid. We'll figure this out." Aisha nodded, but her anxiety was rising. Tommy leaned in closer, offering her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry. We've got this," he said, his voice low but confident. She didn't know what to expect, but she trusted them. The bikers dismounted, each of them moving with the calm precision that only years of experience could bring. Bear and Diesel, the largest of the group, made their way toward the small store at the edge of the settlement, while the others fanned out, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of trouble. Aisha stayed close to Tommy, her eyes darting around nervously as they walked. The place felt wrong, like something sinister was lurking just out of sight. As they approached the store, the door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a weathered face and a hard look in his eyes. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. This was the man she had seen earlier, the one who had been following her across the dunes. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she felt like the world around her had stopped. Bear stepped forward, his presence commanding. "What do you want with her?" he demanded. The man didn't speak at first, but the tension in the air was thick. Aisha could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, but she knew that if she did, it would only make things worse. The man finally spoke, his voice cold and low. "She doesn't belong here. You don't know who you're dealing with." A chill ran down Aisha's spine. She didn't know who he was, but she could tell that he was dangerous. The bikers stood their ground, their faces hardening as they readied themselves for whatever was about to happen. Jack's voice broke the silence. "We're taking her with us. You can leave now, or we'll make you." The man scoffed, stepping back and drawing something from his coat. Aisha's eyes widened in horror as she realized what he was holding, a gun. The bikers moved in immediately, surrounding him. The situation was escalating fast, but Aisha could feel a strange sense of calm wash over her. For the first time in hours, she didn't feel alone. She had found her protectors, and they weren't going to let her down. The tension in the air was palpable as the man in front of Aisha raised the gun, its cold metal gleaming under the harsh desert sun. The bikers immediately closed in, their bodies blocking any escape routes. Jack, the leader of the group, stood at the forefront, his eyes locked onto the man with the weapon. "Put it down, now." Jack's voice was firm and commanding, like thunder before a storm. The man hesitated for a moment, his finger twitching on the trigger. Aisha's heart raced in her chest, but she held her breath, not wanting to make any sudden moves. She knew that every second mattered. The air was thick with tension as the man glared at Jack, his grip on the gun tightening. The silence stretched on, each biker waiting for the first sign of action. Tommy, the young biker who had been with Aisha since the beginning, edged closer to her. He could see the fear in her eyes and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered, though his voice betrayed the anxiety he was feeling. "We won't let him hurt you." The man with the gun sneered, taking a step forward, his eyes flicking nervously between Jack and the others. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "I'll make sure you all regret this." Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his broad frame cutting a commanding figure. "You don't want to make this a bigger problem than it already is," Jack said, his voice calm, but there was a steeliness to it that made the man pause. A few tense seconds passed before the man finally lowered the gun, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're lucky," the man muttered, backing away slowly. "But this isn't over." Jack nodded to Diesel, the largest of the group, who stepped forward to grab the man by the arm. "I think it is," Diesel said, his grip like iron. "Now, get out of here, before you really regret it." The man jerked his arm away, muttering under his breath as he turned and disappeared into the desert, his footsteps fading into the distance. Aisha let out a shaky breath, her body still tense, but the danger had passed, for now. "Are you all right?" Tommy asked, his voice soft but steady. Aisha nodded, though the fear in her eyes hadn't completely faded. She was safe, for the moment, but the uncertainty of what might happen next still lingered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack turned to her, his expression softening. "You're safe with us now," he reassured her. "We'll make sure no one hurts you again." The rest of the bikers nodded in agreement, their faces hardening in determination. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the group of bikers began to regroup, their focus now turning to the next steps. They knew this wasn't over, but for now, Aisha was safe, and that was all that mattered. Jack turned to the group. "We need to get her out of here, and fast. The man who just left won't stop coming after her. We need to figure out who he is and what he wants." The bikers nodded, each one understanding the gravity of the situation. Bear, the leader, looked around at the group, his eyes scanning the desert landscape. "We'll take her somewhere safe. Then we start looking for answers." The group of bikers mounted their motorcycles and revved the engines, the roar of the bikes filling the air as they set off into the desert night. The wind whipped around them, and Aisha could feel the vibrations of the motorcycles beneath her. She clung to Tommy as they rode, her heart still racing from the close call. But for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of relief. The bikers were with her now. They had promised to protect her, and Aisha believed them. The desert stretched out ahead of them, endless and empty, but the bikers rode with purpose, determined to find the answers they needed to keep Aisha safe. As the night grew darker, they reached a small, secluded area in the desert, far from the settlement where they had encountered the man. Bear stopped and dismounted, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "This will do for now," he said. "We'll make camp here for the night. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what we're dealing with." The group set up camp quickly, the sounds of the desert surrounding them. Aisha sat near the campfire, still in shock from everything that had happened. She looked up at the stars above, the vastness of the desert both comforting and overwhelming. She was far from home, far from the safety she had once known, but now, with the bikers, she wasn't alone. They were her family now, and she knew they would protect her no matter what came next. The night air was still and cold as the small campfire crackled softly in the center of the bikers' encampment. The shadows from the flickering flames danced across the faces of the men and women who had become Aisha's protectors. She sat quietly on the ground, her small frame wrapped tightly in a leather jacket that was much too big for her. The fire's warmth was a small comfort, but it didn't quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. What had she gotten herself into? She had come so far, yet the danger still seemed so close. She couldn't shake the image of the man with the gun, his cold eyes, and the terrifying way he had raised the weapon toward the bikers. What did he want with her? Why had he been following her? As Aisha stared into the fire, Tommy sat down beside her, his presence grounding her in the chaotic storm of emotions she was feeling. He noticed her silence and gave her a soft smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was. "I think so," Aisha replied, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't sure if she could ever truly feel safe again. The fear was still there, lingering beneath her skin. Tommy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right. We're going to figure this out," he said. His words were comforting, but they didn't completely ease the knot in her stomach. She had trusted them to protect her, but the fear of what was waiting for her in the future still gnawed at her. Meanwhile, Bear and the other bikers were gathered around, speaking in low voices, their faces grim. They were making plans for the next move, trying to figure out who the man with the gun was, and why he had been following Aisha. Diesel, the largest of the group, spoke up, his voice as deep and steady as ever. "We need to figure out where this guy came from. He's not just some random guy out here. He's after something, and it's not just Aisha. Bear nodded, his face hardening with determination. We find him, we get answers. We won't stop until we know what's going on. As the bikers continued to discuss their next steps, Aisha's thoughts drifted back to her own life. She had never imagined that something like this would happen to her. She had grown up in a small, quiet town, far from the danger and violence she had seen today. She had always felt safe there, surrounded by her family, her friends, her familiar surroundings. But now, she was far from home, caught up in something she didn't understand. Her heart ached as she thought about her mother, the only family she had left. What would happen to her if anything happened to Aisha? Would she ever see her again? Would she be safe? Her mind raced with unanswered questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Hey, Tommy said, interrupting her thoughts. You're not alone in this, okay? We've got your back. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. But what if they come after me again? What if they find me? Tommy's face softened. We won't let that happen. I promise you. Bear looked over at the two of them and gave a nod. He's right, Aisha. You're not alone. We've got a lot of people looking out for you now. The words were comforting, but they didn't erase the fear inside her. She still didn't know who was after her, or why. But one thing was certain. She wasn't alone anymore. As the night dragged on, the bikers began to settle down, each finding a spot to rest. The quiet of the desert seemed to press in on Aisha, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. She laid down on a blanket, wrapping it tightly around her, trying to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the man with the gun flashed before her, and she was back in the desert, running for her life. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. She had to find out who was after her, and why. But for now, all she could do was wait. As the fire burned low and the moon rose high in the sky, Aisha could only wonder what the next day would bring. Would they find the man who had been following her? Would they be able to stop him before it was too late? The uncertainty of it all hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But as she lay there, surrounded by the bikers who had become her family, she felt a glimmer of hope. They would protect her. They would find the answers. And somehow, in the midst of all this chaos, she would find her way home. The morning sun had barely risen when the bikers packed up their camp. Aisha, still wrapped in her blanket, watched them silently as they prepared for what lay ahead. The desert stretched before them like a vast, empty canvas, but beneath its quiet surface, she knew danger was lurking. Her thoughts were still a whirlwind, a constant replay of the man who had been following her, and the sudden, unexpected confrontation the night before. She had barely slept, her mind racing with fear and questions. Who was he? Why had he been after her? And what did he want? The bikers, however, were focused. They had one goal, to find answers. Jack, the leader of the group, stood at the center of the small camp, giving orders. His deep voice carried the weight of experience and authority. We're heading to the settlement, he said. We'll find out what we're dealing with. Stay sharp. No mistakes. Diesel, the hulking figure who had become a silent protector to Aisha, looked over at her as he buckled his gear. You ready? He asked, his voice soft but steady. Aisha nodded, her stomach tightening with a mix of fear and anticipation. She didn't know if she was ready for what lay ahead, but she knew she had no choice. She had to face whatever was coming, and she would face it with the bikers by her side. Tommy, who had been so calm with her the night before, offered a reassuring smile. We've got this, he said. His voice was filled with confidence, but Aisha could see the tension in his eyes. He knew how serious things were. The group mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life, their rumbling sound echoing in the still desert. Aisha climbed onto Tommy's bike once again, her heart pounding in her chest. As they sped off, the wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dust and dry earth. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but there was a feeling of purpose in the air now. Aisha wasn't sure what to expect, but she trusted these bikers. They had promised to protect her, and she was starting to believe they would. The settlement was small, a collection of rundown buildings that looked out of place against the harsh landscape. As they approached, the bikers slowed, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Bear led the way, his gaze sharp and alert. Keep it quiet, he instructed. We don't know who's watching. They rode in a tight formation, moving through the settlement with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The streets were empty, the buildings standing like silent sentinels. As they reached the edge of the town, Bear signaled for them to stop. "This is where it gets tricky," he said. "Stay close and watch your backs." Aisha, her heart racing, looked around nervously. She didn't know who was out there or what they would find, but the tension in the air was thick. As the bikers dismounted, Aisha stayed close to Tommy, her eyes darting around. Bear, Diesel, and the others fanned out, moving cautiously towards the heart of the settlement. The place felt abandoned, like a ghost town, but Aisha knew better than to let her guard down. She had seen enough to know that danger could be hiding in the shadows. "We're looking for information," Bear said quietly as he approached the old saloon at the center of the settlement. "We find someone who knows what's going on, and we get the answers we need." The bikers entered the saloon one by one, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the room was empty except for a few old tables and chairs. It looked like no one had been here for years. But as the bikers moved further inside, they noticed something that made their blood run cold. A door at the back of the room creaked open, and out stepped a man, tall, gaunt, with a scar running down his cheek. His eyes locked onto Aisha immediately, and a slow smile spread across his face. Aisha froze, her heart racing. This was the man who had been following her. She knew it the moment she saw him. The man stepped forward, his voice smooth but cold. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his gaze never leaving Aisha. "I knew you'd come. I just didn't think it would be with this much muscle." Jack stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What do you want with her?" he demanded, his voice filled with authority. The man laughed softly, a cruel sound that sent shivers down Aisha's spine. "Oh, it's not about what I want with her," he said. "It's about what she has. You see, she's connected to something much bigger than you or me. And I'm here to make sure she doesn't get in the way of what's coming next." Aisha's mind raced. What could he be talking about? What did she have that was so important? She felt a growing sense of dread as the man's words sank in. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Bear and the others stood firm, not showing any sign of fear. They were ready for whatever came next. But Aisha knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The man stepped closer, his smile widening. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" he said. "But trust me, you're in way over your heads." And with those words, the situation escalated. The bikers readied themselves, but Aisha knew that the confrontation was only just starting. Whatever this man wanted, it was about to get much more dangerous. The man's cold, calculating smile widened as he took a step closer to Aisha. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer as the bikers tensed, their eyes narrowing. Aisha's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to steady her breathing. This wasn't just a confrontation. It felt like a reckoning, and she could feel the weight of it settling around her like an inescapable storm. Jack, standing tall and unflinching, took a step forward, his voice steady and commanding. "What do you want with her?" he demanded again, but the man only chuckled. "What I want, my friend, is something far beyond your reach," he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying an eerie sense of certainty. "And as for the girl, well, she has something that I need. Something that you won't understand until it's too late." Aisha felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at Jack, then to Tommy and Diesel, who were standing at the ready. They looked like they were prepared for anything, but even they couldn't hide the unease that was creeping into their posture. The man, sensing their discomfort, took another step closer, his presence oppressive. "You've all made a mistake," he continued, his eyes flicking from one biker to the next. "This doesn't have to get ugly, but it will. And when it does, you'll wish you'd stayed out of this." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment, no one moved. Bear's expression didn't change, but there was a glint in his eyes that told Aisha this wasn't the first time he'd faced someone like this. "We're not backing down," Bear said, his voice gravelly and calm, the threat clear in his tone. The man laughed again, a cold, humorless sound. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice rising. "You and your little gang of misfits? You have no idea what you're up against." He took a step back, reaching for something inside his coat. Aisha's heart raced as she watched his every move, unsure of what was coming next. But before the man could fully reach whatever it was he intended to draw, Tommy's voice cut through the tension. "We don't want trouble," Tommy said, his tone soft but firm. But if you're planning on making this worse, I promise you won't like how it ends. The man paused, his eyes flicking to Tommy. For a brief moment, Aisha thought he might back down, but then the man's lips curled into a smile. I'm not scared of you, he said, the malice in his voice unmistakable. He took another step back, his hand still hidden inside his coat. Aisha's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. This was it. It was about to escalate, and there was no way to stop it. Jack stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the man. You've had your warning, Jack said coldly. Now, you either leave, or we'll make you. The man's smile faded, and his hand finally revealed what he had been holding. A small, sleek pistol, its cold metal glinting in the dim light. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. This was real. This was happening. The man aimed the gun at Jack, his eyes filled with cold determination. For a moment, everything froze. The tension in the air was thick, and Aisha could barely breathe. Jack didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his hands relaxed at his sides. Diesel and Tommy both moved into position, but Jack held up a hand, signaling for them to stay back. The man's finger hovered over the trigger. You think you can stop me? He said again, his voice tight with anger. You think these bikers can protect you? Aisha's mind raced. She could see it all happening in slow motion. The man with the gun, the bikers surrounding him, the tension that hung between them. And then, with a sudden, sharp movement, the man lunged forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before the shot could ring out, the sound of roaring engines filled the air. The ground trembled beneath them as dozens of motorcycles appeared at the edge of the settlement. The bikers had arrived. Aisha's heart soared with relief, but it was short-lived as she realized who was behind them. The man's eyes widened in shock as the new bikers stormed into the settlement, their leather jackets glistening under the sun. These weren't just any bikers. They were part of a larger gang, a rival group. The man with the gun cursed under his breath, realizing he was surrounded. You've made a mistake, he hissed, turning to make a run for it. But before he could get far, Bear shouted, No one moves. The bikers moved in swiftly, surrounding the man and pinning him in place. You're not going anywhere, Bear said. The man struggled briefly, but it was clear he was outnumbered and outmatched. Bear stepped forward, grabbing the man by the collar and lifting him off the ground. What's your game, huh? Bear asked, his voice cold and calm. The man's face twisted in fury, but he said nothing. It was clear now that the man wasn't just a lone threat. He was part of something much bigger. Aisha's pulse raced. They had him, but what now? She had come to them for protection, and she had it. But this was only the beginning. There was a larger game at play, and Aisha knew that the bikers would do whatever it took to uncover the truth and protect her from whatever came next. The air was thick with the tension that had been building since the man with the gun had appeared. Bear's grip on the stranger's collar tightened as he lifted him off the ground, the weight of his words heavy in the silence that followed. What's your game? Bear asked again, his voice calm, but carrying the authority of someone who had seen too much to be intimidated. The man hung limp for a moment, clearly out of options. Aisha watched, her heart still pounding, as the situation shifted from one of uncertainty to one of overwhelming control. The other bikers surrounded them, their eyes hard with determination. It was clear to everyone that they weren't going to let this man leave without answers. The man's eyes flickered to Aisha, and for a brief second, his expression softened, a flicker of recognition passing through them. But he quickly masked it with a sneer. You really think you've got me? He spat, his voice thick with contempt. You've got no idea what's coming. Jack stepped forward, his boots thudding softly on the dusty ground as he closed the distance between himself and the man. You're not leaving here until we get the answers we need, Jack said firmly, his eyes narrowing. So, you're going to tell us everything. Now. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. It's too late for that. You can't stop what's already in motion. Aisha felt a cold chill at the words. She didn't know what the man was talking about, but she could sense that whatever it wasn't good. The bikers stood firm, not allowing him to move an inch. Start talking. Diesel growled, his presence like a mountain behind the man. The stranger hesitated, then his shoulders slumped as if the fight had drained out of him. He looked around at the bikers, his eyes calculating, then back at Aisha. It's not about her, he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Not really. It's about what she carries. What she's connected to. Aisha's heart skipped a beat, and she took a step back, suddenly feeling very exposed. She didn't understand. What did he mean by what she carries? What was it that made her so important? Jack's gaze never left the man as he spoke. What are you talking about? What does she have? The man took a deep breath, his face hardening once again. You wouldn't understand, he said with a shake of his head. But it doesn't matter. You're too late. The wheels are already in motion. The people who are after her are far more dangerous than I could ever be. And they won't stop until they get what they want. Aisha's stomach twisted in fear. She had no idea who was after her or what they wanted, but it was clear now that this was bigger than her. It wasn't just one man. There was an entire group out there, and they wouldn't rest until they had whatever it was that Aisha was connected to. Who are they? Tommy's voice cut through the silence. His concern mirrored on his face. The man opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by a distant rumble, the sound of motorcycles growing louder. The group froze. The bikers exchanged wary glances as the sounds of the approaching vehicles grew nearer. They're here, the man hissed. You're not prepared for them. Bear pushed the man aside and turned his attention to the approaching bikes. The horizon was beginning to darken as the shapes of motorcycles appeared in the distance, their engines roaring through the night. There were too many to count, each one moving with the same sense of purpose, like a storm on the horizon. Aisha's pulse quickened as she realized that this wasn't just a confrontation with a single man. It was the beginning of something much bigger. We need to move, now. Bear barked, his voice filled with urgency. The bikers immediately mounted their bikes, ready for what was to come. The stranger's smug expression faded as he realized that things were slipping beyond his control. You think you can outrun them? He spat, his eyes filled with defiance. But the bikers didn't hesitate. They revved their engines, the sound of their bikes shaking the ground beneath them. Jack and Bear exchanged a quick glance. We won't run, Jack said, his voice full of resolve. We'll stand our ground. Aisha climbed onto Tommy's bike once more, gripping him tightly as they sped off into the night. The group of bikers rode together, moving swiftly, cutting through the desert with an unspoken understanding. They weren't just protecting Aisha. They were preparing for a battle they knew was coming. As the wind whipped past them, Aisha could feel the weight of the moment settling in. She had no idea who was coming for her or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life was never going to be the same. The bikers had promised to protect her, but now, they were heading straight into the heart of the storm. The distant rumble of approaching motorcycles was growing louder, and Aisha's heart raced with the anticipation of what was to come. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she couldn't face it alone. And with the bikers by her side, she wasn't alone anymore. The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, their engines roaring like an impending storm. Aisha could feel the vibrations in her chest as Tommy's bike sped through the desert, the wind whipping around them. The rest of the bikers followed closely, their formation tight, ready for whatever was coming. Her heart raced in her chest, the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawing at her. She had been running from something for so long, but now it felt like she was running straight into the heart of it. As they rode, the horizon darkened, the sun setting behind them and casting long shadows across the sand. The faint glow of headlights from the approaching motorcycles pierced through the dusky air, growing brighter with each passing second. Tommy leaned into the bike, urging it to go faster as the rumble of the other riders reached a deafening crescendo. Aisha gripped his waist, her knuckles white as fear coursed through her veins. The bikers didn't speak much as they rode, their focus unwavering. Bear, at the front of the group, was scanning the surroundings, his sharp eyes alert for any sign of movement. They all knew that whoever was behind those bikes wasn't just coming for Aisha. They were coming for all of them. Jack's voice crackled over the intercom. We're going to make a stand here, he said, his tone steady but filled with a quiet urgency. When they arrive, we don't back down. We face them head on. Diesel, the massive biker, nodded without a word. He was always ready for a fight, his massive frame brimming with the kind of strength that could move mountains. As they neared a small rise in the desert, the lead bikers pulled to a stop, their motorcycles kicking up dust. They dismounted quickly, their boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Aisha's breath came in short gasps as she followed Tommy, staying close to him. She looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. There were no signs of life in the desert, just the endless expanse of sand, and the distant silhouettes of the bikes that were rapidly closing in. Bear turned to face the group. "We wait here," he said, his voice low but commanding. "They'll be here any minute." The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Aisha could feel the fear rising inside her. Again, but she forced it down. She had to be strong. For herself. For the bikers. For the people who had taken her in and promised to protect her. They weren't just bikers anymore. They were her family. The distant rumble of engines grew louder as the unknown riders drew closer, the dust trailing behind them like a storm. Aisha's heart skipped a beat as she saw the headlights approaching, the group of motorcycles forming a menacing line on the horizon. There were at least a dozen of them, their bikes gleaming in the dim light, their riders wearing the same dark, intimidating leather jackets. They were here. Aisha swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She tried to steady her breathing, but it felt impossible. She glanced at Tommy, who gave her a brief, reassuring nod. He was still tense, but there was a calm in his eyes that gave her some small measure of comfort. Jack stepped forward, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "Let's do this," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet authority. Bear nodded, his eyes scanning the incoming riders. They were just a few hundred feet away now, their engines roaring in a synchronized rhythm. The bikers stood firm, ready for whatever came next. Aisha stood next to Tommy, her body rigid with fear and anticipation. The riders slowed as they neared the bikers' position, their eyes locked onto the group of protectors who stood their ground. The two groups faced each other in a tense standoff, the silence between them broken only by the sound of the motorcycles idling. The leader of the approaching group, a tall man with a scar across his face, dismounted his bike and walked forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Bear and the others. "So, you think you can protect her?" the man asked, his voice low and rough. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Bear didn't flinch, his expression hardening. "We don't care who you are," Bear replied, his voice steady. "She's under our protection now, and we're not backing down." The man laughed darkly, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You're not as tough as you think," he said, his voice rising. "You think you can just stand in our way? We don't have to be tough." Diesel spoke up from behind, his deep voice carrying through the air. "We just have to be willing to fight for what's right." The leader's smile faltered, but he didn't retreat. "This is your last chance," he growled. "Get out of our way, or things are going to get ugly." Aisha could feel the tension thickening in the air, like a storm ready to break. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain, she was no longer alone. The bikers had made their stand, and they weren't going to back down. The leader of the other group glanced over his shoulder, as if giving a signal to his riders. The sound of engines revving echoed through the desert, and the bikers prepared for the inevitable clash. Aisha's heart raced in her chest, but she knew that whatever happened, she had her family, her new family, by her side. The battle was about to begin. The silence that had settled between the two groups was shattered by the roar of engines as both sides revved their motorcycles, preparing for what was to come. The tension was so thick, it felt like the desert itself held its breath. Aisha could feel every muscle in her body tense, but she stood firm next to Tommy, her heart racing. The bikers were ready, their eyes filled with determination, their hands gripping the handlebars with practiced ease. Bear stood tall in front, unwavering as the leader of their group. The other group's leader, the man with the scar, smirked as he watched them, his eyes filled with arrogance. "You think you can stand up to us? You're nothing but a bunch of bikers, just waiting to get put in their place," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Bear didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered as he met the other man's challenge. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice low and calm, but filled with steel. The other riders began to slowly circle the group, their motorcycles humming as they moved in closer. The sand kicked up beneath the tires, swirling in the hot desert air as the standoff intensified. Aisha's pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to steady her breath. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. These men, the ones who had come for her, were not going to stop. Tommy leaned in close to her, his voice barely audible over the noise of the engines. "Stay close. Don't move. Unless I tell you," he said, his eyes locked on the leader of the rival gang. Aisha nodded, her hand gripping the back of his jacket as she stayed close. The man with the scar barked out orders, his voice sharp. I want them scattered. Make them regret standing in our way. Without warning, his men surged forward, revving their engines and speeding toward the bikers. Aisha's heart skipped a beat as the first rider from the other group launched himself toward Bear. It was clear that the fight had begun. The clash was immediate. Tires screeched against the sand as the two groups collided, each biker weaving between the others, trying to outmaneuver and outfight their opponent. Jack, Diesel, and the rest of the bikers were already in the thick of it, each one engaging with a rival biker. Aisha stood frozen for a moment, watching the chaos unfold before her. It was a blur of motion, flashing leather, the roar of engines, and the sound of fists meeting flesh. But through it all, Aisha could see Tommy. He was right there, fighting alongside them, pushing back against the attackers with the force of someone who had fought before. The rival leader charged at Bear, his motorcycle kicking up a cloud of dust as he aimed directly for the group's leader. Bear didn't flinch, standing his ground as he expertly maneuvered his bike to intercept the leader. The two collided in a dramatic burst of sound, their bikes locking for a moment before they separated, both riders expertly maintaining control. Bear revved his engine, the rumble shaking the ground beneath them as he faced the man head-on. "You're not going to get away that easily," Bear growled, his voice rough with anger and adrenaline. The man with the scar sneered, clearly not intimidated. "We'll see about that," he said, before charging again. Aisha's breath caught as she watched the two leaders prepare for another round. She wanted to run, to get out of the way, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene. The battle was fierce, but she knew that Bear and his bikers weren't going to back down. The sounds of the fight echoed through the desert, but despite the chaos around her, Aisha felt a sense of calm. The bikers were not just protecting her, they were fighting for something bigger. They were standing up to the people who had come for her, who had tried to break her down. And they weren't going to stop until they had taken back control. Tommy was still by her side, his movements swift and purposeful as he fought off one of the attackers. The man was bigger than Tommy, but Tommy was faster, ducking and weaving as he landed punch after punch. Aisha couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. These bikers had become her family, her protectors, and they were fighting for her, no questions asked. She wasn't alone anymore. As the battle raged on, Aisha saw the man with the scar start to retreat, realizing that he was losing ground. Bear, on the other hand, was relentless. With a fierce roar, he charged forward once more, knocking the rival leader off balance and sending him tumbling into the sand. "It's over," Bear said, his voice calm but final. "You're done." The rival gang's members, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. One by one, they pulled back, their eyes flicking nervously between the bikers who stood their ground. The tension hung in the air for a moment longer, and then, like a wave crashing down, the rival gang members turned and began to retreat, their engines roaring as they sped away into the distance. Bear and the rest of the bikers watched them go, their expressions hardening with the knowledge that this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Aisha let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fight was over, for now, but she knew that the battle wasn't done. She was safe for the moment, but the war was far from over. Tommy turned to her, a rare smile crossing his face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Aisha nodded, her chest still tight with the remnants of fear. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "I think so." The bikers gathered together, their victory hard-won, but not without cost. The sun was now setting, casting long shadows across the desert as the group began to regroup. They had won this battle, but they knew that the fight for Aisha's safety was far from over. The desert air was heavy with the scent of dust and the lingering adrenaline from the battle that had just unfolded. The rival gang had retreated, their motorcycles disappearing into the distance, leaving the bikers behind in the aftermath of the skirmish. The silence that followed was deafening, each rider still catching their breath, eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Aisha stood with Tommy, her heart still racing, her chest heaving as she tried to process what had just happened. The tension of the fight still gripped her, but something else had taken root deep in her chest: gratitude. Gratitude for the bikers who had risked everything to protect her, to stand in the face of danger without hesitation. They weren't just strangers anymore. They had become her family. "You did good, kid," Tommy said, his voice calm but warm as he glanced down at her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You guys were the ones who fought." Tommy chuckled softly, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're part of this now. We all fight together." Aisha nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She felt it too. For the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't feel alone. She had a family, one that was fiercely protective, that would go to any lengths to keep her safe. Jack, Diesel, and Bear approached the group, their expressions hard but satisfied. "It's over for now," Jack said, his voice low but full of conviction. "But we're not done. We need to find out who sent those guys after you, Aisha. And we need to figure out why they think you're so important." Aisha's stomach tightened. She still had no idea what was happening, but one thing was certain. She wasn't just running from a random threat. There was something bigger at play, something connected to her. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bear's steely gaze softened as he looked at her. "Now, we take you somewhere safe," he said, his tone unwavering. "And then we start digging. We'll find out what they want. And we'll make sure they never come after you again." Aisha swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side of this, but she knew she couldn't face it alone. The bikers were right. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for answers, and she was determined to get them. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the site, the air felt thick with the promise of the unknown. The desert had been quiet moments ago, but now, the sound of engines revving echoed once again, signaling the start of another journey. The bikers mounted their bikes, ready to take Aisha to safety. She climbed on behind Tommy, her fingers gripping the leather tightly. The group rode out in formation, the rumble of the engines shaking the ground beneath them as they sped into the night. Aisha sat close to Tommy, the cold wind whipping through her hair, but she didn't feel the same fear that she had earlier. The bikers had made sure she was safe, and for the first time in days, she felt like she had a purpose. The desert stretched out before them, the stars above their heads like silent witnesses to the journey ahead. They rode through the night, stopping only when the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The landscape around them had changed, the vast emptiness of the desert giving way to the scattered signs of civilization. They had made it to a small town, far from the dangers they had left behind. Aisha looked around, taking in the unfamiliar sights and sounds. It wasn't much, but it felt like a safe haven after everything that had happened. As the bikers pulled into a secluded area behind a small motel, Jack turned to Aisha. "This will be our base for a while," he said. "We need to lay low until we figure out who's behind all of this." Aisha nodded, her mind racing with questions, but for now, she was grateful for the quiet, grateful for the space to breathe. Bear looked at the rest of the group. "We'll take turns keeping watch," he said, his voice firm. "And we start tracking down leads tomorrow. This isn't over, but we'll find out what's going on, one way or another." The group disbanded to settle in, but Aisha remained by Tommy's side. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over, that there was more to come. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. These bikers weren't just her protectors, they were her family now. And together, they would face whatever was ahead. As the sun set behind them, casting long shadows over the town, Aisha took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. It was a small step, but it was a step toward something more. Toward answers. Toward safety. Toward a future where she wasn't running anymore. The night passed slowly for Aisha. The small town was quieter than she expected, a stark contrast to the chaos that had become her life over the past few days. She sat at a table in the motel room, her mind racing as she stared out the window at the dusty streets. The bikers had already begun their work, splitting up to track down leads, but the air still hung heavy with the promise of something darker lurking just beyond their reach. Aisha could feel it in her gut. The man who had been following her, the mysterious threat that had loomed over her life for so long. It wasn't over yet. Tommy sat across from her, his eyes scanning the street outside, always alert. He hadn't said much since they'd arrived, but Aisha knew he was just as on edge as she was. "You all right?" he asked after a moment, his voice steady but soft. She nodded, though the unease she felt wasn't something she could easily shake off. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" Tommy's gaze never wavered from the window, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. I don't know, Aisha said quietly. I keep thinking about why all this is happening. What they want from me. Tommy leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. You're not alone in this, Aisha. We're all in this together. The bikers, they're like family. They'll protect you, no matter what comes next. Aisha looked up at him, grateful for his reassurance, but deep down, the fear was still there. She had never asked for this, never expected to be at the center of something so dangerous. But now, as she sat here, in the calm before whatever storm was coming, she couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep her safe. Just then, the sound of a motorcycle engine cut through the silence, followed by the screeching of tires as a rider pulled up outside. Aisha stood up quickly, her heart skipping a beat, but Tommy's steady hand on her shoulder kept her grounded. It's just Bear, he said, his voice calm but filled with knowing. Sure enough, Bear entered the room a few moments later, his presence as imposing as ever. His face was set in a grim expression, and his eyes met Aisha's with a quiet understanding. We got a lead, he said, his voice low. One of the men who attacked us last night is talking. We're going after him. Aisha's stomach tightened at the mention of the attack. The events of the previous night had been brutal, and while the bikers had come out on top, the reality of what was happening was far from over. Who's the lead on this? She asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Diesel and Jack are heading out now, Bear replied. They're going to track down where this guy's been hiding out. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets. Aisha felt the weight of his words settle over her, but she knew she couldn't just sit back. I'm coming with you, she said before she could stop herself. Bear's expression softened just slightly, but his voice remained firm. You're not coming, Aisha. This is too dangerous. She shook her head, her resolve hardening. I can't just sit here while you all go after them. I need to know what's going on. I need to know who they are and why they're after me. Bear studied her for a moment, then sighed. You don't understand. This isn't just about you anymore. This goes deeper than that. These people are dangerous. You could be putting us all at risk. Aisha's eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she could see the vulnerability beneath his tough exterior. I get it, she said quietly. But I don't want to hide anymore. I want to be part of this. I want to help. Bear's gaze softened, and after a long pause, he nodded. All right, you can come. But you stay close, and you follow our lead. Understood. Aisha felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly tempered by the weight of the task ahead. She had made the choice to face whatever came next, and now, there was no turning back. As Bear turned to leave the room, he paused and looked over his shoulder at her. Get your gear. We move out in 30 minutes. Aisha nodded, the adrenaline beginning to build inside her. She wasn't sure what they would find, but she knew one thing. This fight was far from over, and she wasn't going to back down. When she stepped outside, the harsh sunlight hit her face, but the warmth did nothing to ease the cold feeling that settled in her stomach. The bikers were already preparing their bikes, the engines roaring to life one by one. Bear, Jack, and Diesel were huddled together, talking strategy, but Aisha knew this wasn't just about strategy anymore. This was personal. As they geared up, Aisha stood near Tommy, trying to focus on what she needed to do. Tommy turned to her and smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of worry. Ready? He asked, his voice steady. She nodded, though the fear still lingered. Ready, she replied. Together, they mounted their bikes, and as the engines roared to life, Aisha felt the familiar surge of power beneath her. They were heading into the unknown once again, but this time, she wasn't running. This time, she was standing tall beside the bikers, ready to face whatever came next. The sun was beginning to set as the group of bikers rode through the small town, their engines roaring against the quiet evening. The air was heavy with dust and the scent of gasoline, the shadows growing longer as they sped through the streets. Aisha sat close behind Tommy, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline of the earlier confrontation. Despite the chaos they had just been through, a part of her felt strangely calm now, knowing she was not alone. She glanced at the faces of the bikers around her, strong, determined, and unwavering. They had become her family, and she was no longer the frightened girl running from something she couldn't understand. They were all in this together. As they neared a small, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, Bear signaled for everyone to slow down. They had reached their destination. Aisha's stomach tightened with anticipation. This was it. The place where they would finally uncover the truth. Bear stopped his bike first, dismounting with a swift motion and scanning the area. Diesel followed closely behind, his massive form towering as he surveyed the surroundings. "Stay sharp," Bear said, his voice low. "We don't know what we're walking into." The group spread out, moving with quiet precision as they approached the building. Aisha stuck close to Tommy, her eyes darting around as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The building in front of them was old, the windows boarded up, the door cracked open just enough for someone to slip inside. The place looked abandoned, but Aisha knew better than to let her guard down. The bikers had made it clear that the danger was far from over, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they found here would change everything. Jack walked up to the door, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's move," he said quietly. They entered the building cautiously, their footsteps barely making a sound on the creaky floorboards. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. The room was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the floor. Aisha could barely make out the shapes of old furniture and abandoned equipment scattered around. As they moved deeper into the building, Aisha's senses heightened. Every creak of the floor beneath her feet felt louder, the silence around them more oppressive. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This place felt wrong. Bear motioned for them to stop, holding up a hand. The group froze, listening. A faint noise reached their ears, voices. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. "They're here," Bear muttered. "Get ready." The bikers moved into position, their muscles tense as they prepared for whatever was coming next. Aisha stood still, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Jack led the way, his steps steady as he crept forward, peering around a corner. "We've got company," he whispered. Aisha followed behind, staying close to Tommy, her hand gripping his jacket. They moved cautiously, turning down a hallway that led to a set of stairs. At the top, they could hear voices more clearly. Two men, talking in low tones. "Stay close," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. Aisha nodded, feeling a surge of determination flood through her. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She was going to find out who was behind all of this. She had to know the truth. They reached the top of the stairs and crouched low, peering around the corner. The two men were standing near a desk, looking through papers. Neither one seemed to notice the bikers approaching. Bear motioned for them to stay still, his gaze locked on the men. Aisha's pulse raced. She could feel her heart beating in her throat. This was it. The moment they would finally uncover the truth. Jack gave a signal, and without another word, the bikers moved forward, surrounding the men. The two men froze, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons that weren't there. Aisha's eyes widened as she saw the panic on their faces. They had no idea what was coming. "What the hell is this?" one of the men shouted, but his voice faltered as he saw the bikers closing in. Jack stepped forward, his face hard and unyielding. "We're not here to play games," he said. "Tell us who you work for." The man's face paled, and for a moment, he hesitated. The other man, clearly nervous, took a step back. "You don't know what you're messing with," he said, his voice shaking. "You can't stop what's coming." Bear stepped forward, his massive form casting a shadow over the men. "We're done talking," he growled. "Tell us what we want to know, or this ends now." The man swallowed hard, clearly out of options. He looked at his partner, who gave a slight nod. "All right," the first man said, his voice strained. "We work for a group. People who've got money, influence, connections. They want her. They've been looking for her for months." Aisha's heart skipped a beat. "Who are they?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Why do they want me?" The man hesitated, his eyes flickering between the bikers. "It's not just about you," he said quietly. "It's about what you're connected to. There's more at play here than you understand. You're the key to something much bigger." Aisha felt her blood run cold. This was bigger than just her. She had no idea what she was connected to, but she knew now that she was caught in something far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. She was just beginning to understand how deep the conspiracy went. Jack stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Tell us everything," he said. The man swallowed again, and Aisha knew that they were finally starting to get the answers they needed. The truth was out there, and they were going to find it, no matter what. The man's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of revelation. Aisha felt her heart race as the truth began to unfold before her. But it was a truth she wasn't ready to accept. "You're the key to something much bigger," he had said, and those words had pierced her like a blade. She stood there, staring at him, her breath shallow as the enormity of what he was implying sank in. What did he mean? What was she connected to? Why was she so important to these people? Jack, Diesel, and Bear stood around her, their expressions hardened, as if they had known this day would come. They were all waiting for the man to elaborate, but the words that came next only deepened the mystery. "They've been watching you for months," the man continued, his voice now shaking with fear. "You've got something inside you, something they need, and they won't stop until they get it." Aisha swallowed hard, her stomach churning. "What do you mean? What do I have?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. The man finally met her gaze, his eyes full of regret, as if he knew the answer would destroy her sense of safety forever. "I don't know everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're tied to something ancient, something dangerous, and they'll do whatever it takes to get to you." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Aisha stumbled back a step, her hands trembling as she processed the man's confession. This wasn't just some random attack. This was something planned, something much bigger, and she was at the center of it all. The bikers remained silent, their faces grim. Bear stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the man who had just spoken. "Who are they?" Bear asked, his voice like gravel. The man swallowed hard. "You won't believe me," he said. "But they're not just people. They're part of a secret organization, a group that's been pulling strings for centuries. They've been searching for you because you're the key to their ultimate plan." Aisha's mind spun. She couldn't wrap her head around what the man was saying. It sounded insane. But looking around at the bikers, seeing the seriousness in their faces, she knew they weren't just going to let this slide. They had to get to the bottom of it. "Where can we find them?" Jack asked, his voice steady, unwavering. The man shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They operate in the shadows. But I can tell you this, they won't stop coming for you. Not until they get what they want." The tension in the room was suffocating. Aisha could feel it pressing in on her. But there was something else now, something she hadn't felt before, resolve. She wasn't going to run anymore. Not from this. Not from whatever was coming. She glanced at the bikers, her eyes meeting each of theirs. They had stood by her, fought for her, and now, they were going to help her face whatever this was. "We're going after them," Aisha said, her voice firm. The bikers exchanged looks, but none of them hesitated. "You don't have to do this alone," Tommy said quietly, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "We're with you. We'll protect you, no matter what." Aisha nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. She had found her family in this group of bikers. They weren't just her protectors, they were her warriors, and together, they were going to take on whatever threat lay ahead. Bear stepped forward, giving a slight nod of approval. "All right," he said. "We tracked them down. We put an end to this. For good." The group moved out swiftly, mounting their bikes and revving the engines. The adrenaline was already kicking in as they prepared to face the unknown. Aisha clung to Tommy, her mind focused, her resolve firm. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop until the truth was uncovered. As they rode off into the night, the sound of their engines cutting through the silence, Aisha could feel the weight of what lay ahead. The fight was far from over, but now, with the bikers by her side, she was ready. Whatever the future held, she would face it head-on. The desert stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving, but Aisha was no longer afraid. The riders were her family now, and together, they would conquer whatever came their way. Experience the thrilling adventure in this gripping tale of survival and loyalty, as a young girl finds herself entangled in a dangerous conspiracy. In this intense journey, Aisha is caught between a powerful underground group and a group of fearless bikers who are ready to risk everything to protect her. The story unfolds with high stakes, deep secrets, and unexpected twists, showcasing the unwavering bond of brotherhood among the bikers. As Aisha uncovers her connection to a dark and ancient power, the Hell Angel stories take on a whole new meaning, intertwining the supernatural with the harsh reality of survival. With every chapter, the tension builds, and the bikers must fight not only for their lives but for the truth. With the rival gang hunting Aisha, the Hell Angels stories reveal the shocking depth of the danger they face, and the lengths they will go to stop those who threaten their family. The fight reaches a boiling point, and as Aisha embraces her new reality, she learns that the Hell Angel stories are far more complex than she ever imagined. Join the ride through this wild, heart-pounding narrative, and discover the truth behind the Hell Angel stories, where no one is safe and everyone must make a stand. The battle for Aisha's survival continues, and the Hell Angel stories unfold with each daring move, drawing closer to the ultimate revelation.